Hi, welcome back. This week we'll be, or I guess the slides will be talking about consequentialist moral theories and objections, and some replies to those objections. Specifically, we're going to talk about utilitarianism, and some of the concerns that have historically been raised about utility, and some of the responses that utilitarians had. Now, each of these objections and replies come from some of the original objections in the 18th century to John Stuart Mill's, or to Jeremy Bentham's original proposition of utilitarianism. And the replies are all collected in a book by John Stuart Mill, who is Jeremy Bentham's godson, the son of James Mill. So these are all fairly long-standing objections and a long-standing set of replies as well that have sort of shaped the way people look at utilitarianism today. Here's a sort of a chart about how the consequentialist theories shape up. It turns out that in utilitarian theory, there's a couple of different divisions. There's act utilitarians and rule utilitarians, and then there's utilitarians who focus on quality or quantity, and these aren't exclusive. So you could be a rule utilitarian who focuses on quality, or a rule utilitarian who focuses on quantity, or likewise you could be an act utilitarian focused on quantity or quality. At least some level, these distinctions aren't between different types of moral theory. They're all approaches to utilitarianism, and in practice, most people are not either an act or a rule utilitarian. Most people are not either focused on quality or quantity, but rather usually these distinctions between rule and act and quality and quantity are applied in a sort of ad hoc fashion. That is, when the case presents itself, people tend to do an analysis based on whichever version of utilitarianism they think applies best at that time. There's some reason to think that having these distinctions makes utilitarianism more flexible, but applying it in this sort of ad hoc way, whichever one we choose at the sort of moment, does run the risk of giving us not a single moral theory that we're working with, and it runs the risk of us sort of cherry-picking our results. And so it's a concern. So if you think that one version is more defensible than another, you'd have to say why it's more defensible in some circumstances and then not others. And so there's some concern about whether or not you should always be an act utilitarian, say, or whether you should apply act utilitarianism in one sort of situation and rule in the other. That being said, I think it's best for now just to look at these as ways to respond to potential objections with utilitarianism. So, remember, utilitarian moral theory is a moral theory based on this premise of the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness principle just values happiness in all of its forms. So anywhere there's happiness to be had or misery to be avoided, it's good to find that happiness, and it's bad if you end up in misery. So the greatest happiness principle is just that an action is right as it tends to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. The more happiness you can produce, the better. So far we've been talking about act utilitarianism. It's just as the view that in any given situation, the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number is the right action to take. And so the point of act utilitarianism here is that the level of analysis is about the choice of a single action. What to do in this situation. What action should I take in this one situation? You do the analysis on the given situation. Now, one objection to that is that if we evaluate the effects of all stakeholders for every available option of a given action, we're going to get some good results. So you remember the chart we did at the end of the last set of slides. It took maybe a half an hour to work through two possible options in that one scenario. So a half an hour is not a terribly long time, but it does take a while. And it turns out that often when we're making a moral decision, we don't really have a half an hour. So when somebody asks me why my kid didn't make it to school, right, and so I consider the option, well, maybe I should lie and say, well, he had to go to the dentist, or maybe I should tell the truth and say I decided to take him to the zoo. One's a lie, one's not. But there's a sort of incentive to tell a lie. You want to protect your child's academic record or something like that. I don't have a half an hour to make that decision. Right? I have to make that decision right now. So an ACT analysis would be impossible to perform, at least in a robust way, in that situation. And so one objection to ACT utilitarianism is if we evaluate individual actions and what we're going to do for each action, we're going to quickly run out of time in most of the important situations. So a response to this problem comes from John Stuart Mill. He says the right thing to do is to produce a moral rule. That is, a rule that if we follow the rule would produce the greatest good for the greatest number. So rather than in every situation where we're tempted to lie, looking at the question and going, well, what should I do in this situation? Tell the truth or not? Rather, we should, after a couple of those situations, we should generalize, and we should say, well, there's 4 or 5 times I've been tempted to lie, and I did the utilitarian analysis for each one of those, and it turned out that almost all the time it's better to tell the truth than not. So what I should do is have a rule. I tell the truth when confronted with a situation where I'm tempted to lie or tempted to tell the truth. I go with tell the truth. And then, when that situation comes up in the future, you don't have to do the utilitarian analysis each new time. You just say, okay, well, I already did the math, and it turns out that I produce more happiness if I tell the truth in situations like this. So the response is that we could just have a rule to cover things rather than having to do the utilitarian analysis each time we perform an analysis on a rule. So you've got a split in ways to apply a utilitarian analysis. On one hand, you can evaluate each individual action, performing utilitarian calculus each time. And the advantage of that is it's very situation specific, and it gives you a more robust set of considerations for any specific situation. The problem is, sometimes we need to make our decisions more quickly than that sort of robust analysis allows for. In those situations, utilitarians typically favor a rule analysis. Right? That is, we produce some sort of a rule so that we don't have to do an analysis for each separate action. Rather, we come up with a general rule like stealing tends to produce more misery than happiness, so I don't steal. Or when I'm respectful to other people, it tends to produce more happiness than when I'm disrespectful to other people, so I treat people with respect. And these rules are justified based on the results that they produce. The rule tends to produce happiness, and so it's a good rule. So, for instance, if we had a rule against stealing, it would be a good rule if people tended to be happier as a result of following the rule, and it would be a bad rule if people tended to be unhappy as a result of following the rule. So again, it's not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with stealing, or there's anything intrinsically wrong with being disrespectful on the utilitarian view, but rather we might come up with a rule that says we don't steal, not because it's intrinsically wrong, but because stealing tends to produce unhappiness. So we choose not to do that. Okay, a second objection. There's 3, and I'll run through these fairly quickly today. The second objection is that it's difficult to quantify happiness. And here, if you remember the chart we filled in the last set of slides, it is incredibly challenging to figure out, well, how sure are we that somebody will be made happy or sad by an action? How intense will it be? We're put in a position when we're trying to perform this utilitarian calculus of having to sort of work out a numerical system, a kind of mathematics of happiness. And that's difficult to do. Now, it's not impossible. We did it, after all. And it turns out that economists and psychologists and a number of other of the social sciences are really working strenuously, many of them, on how exactly to quantify happiness in better or worse ways. So it's hard to do, but not impossible. So one objection is it's hard to quantify pleasure. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a real chore. And then additionally, you might also be concerned when it comes to talking about happiness that some things that we consider pleasurable, or some things that make us happy, might not be what we think of in sort of common sense terms as legitimate or good moral aims. So for instance, some people are made very happy by sitting on the couch and watching TV and eating donuts. Right? This is like, it just makes them very happy. They'd rather do nothing than that. But it seems like eating donuts and sitting on the couch isn't the best moral goal. Right? So if you're to set a goal for your moral system, if what you end up with is happiness, and what that means is we're trying to get people on the couch, watching TV, eating donuts, it's a disconcerting aim for a moral system. So the objection here has to do with the way we understand happiness. Right? And one part of the objection is it's really hard to quantify happiness. It's hard to put numerical values on the degree of satisfaction somebody experiences from any given action. It's hard to quantify how happy Jim is for getting to sleep on the couch, and it's how happy the kids are for having Uncle Jim there. It's hard to quantify that. And it also seems like some of the things that make us happy aren't so great. Eating donuts while watching TV, for instance. And I don't mean to vilify donuts or TV. I like them both, but that's exactly the point. I like them both, but I'm not sure that they're good moral goals. So, in response to this concern about how we understand happiness, again, John Stuart Mill comes up with a sort of response to this kind of problem. And Mill agrees, right? He says, it's really better to be a man satisfied than better to be a man dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And this really gets at the second part of the objection about what produces happiness for us. If what makes us happy is the same kinds of things that makes a pig happy, right? Wallowing in filth and stuffing our faces, maybe we want to reconsider how we're being made happy. And it's not that there's anything wrong with enjoying a meal or enjoying a show, right? The concern is just that there are probably things that make us happy in a different way. And so Mill's point is, not all pleasures, not all ways to be happy are equally valuable. Some pleasures, he thinks, are qualitatively better than others, even if you get less of it. So my standard example of this is between justice and chocolate. Or if you prefer to think about it this way, you can think about it in terms of love or chocolate. Ask yourself this question. How much chocolate would it take to make up for being treated fairly? Or if you prefer, how much chocolate would it take to make up for the feeling of falling in love for the first time? Is there an amount of chocolate that compares to being treated fairly or falling in love for the first time? For most people, the answer to that is no. Chocolate is clearly a much better thing than falling in love. No, I'm a kid. Somebody always does make that joke. No, the response is typically, I think for most of us, chocolate's great. Right? We almost all love chocolate. It's delicious. But it's not really the same kind of thing as being treated fairly or as falling in love, right? They're qualitatively different. So there's no amount of one that would balance out the other, right? It's just that there's no amount of chocolate that would make up for the experience of being treated fairly or of falling in love, right? These are robust experiences that take up that are only possible for us because we're complicated creatures, because we're the kind of people that we are. Whereas the kind of experience of enjoying chocolate is one that we could have if we were pigs. Right? Pigs like chocolate quite a bit also. But I take it that they don't experience being treated fairly or falling in love anything like the way we do. The point is just, we could be made happy both ways, but there seems to be something intrinsically more valuable about justice than there is about chocolate. And so one of the sort of responses to the concern about how we're made happy is that maybe quantity isn't enough. Maybe it's not enough to say how much happiness, what number would you put on it, because not everything can be measured in terms of quantity. For instance, being treated fairly isn't quantifiable in comparison to an amount of chocolate, right? They're qualitatively different things. And it looks like one of them is qualitatively better. So, how do we know what's qualitatively better? Well, Mill recommends that we distinguish qualities of pleasure based on what he calls it the considered judgment of people who have experienced both sorts of pleasure. So he thinks that what we really ought to do when we're evaluating things is sometimes you can compare apples to apples, right? Quantifying units of happiness about sleeping on the couch is basically the same type of thing for everybody. So we ought to be able to calculate those options in a quantified way. But some things he thinks are different in kind. That is, they're qualitatively different, and so you can't compare them quantitatively. In those cases, you need somebody who has experienced both of the types of pleasure, both qualities of pleasure. So you have to have somebody who's both had chocolate and experienced the sort of the sways of justice. And so, in part, what Mill's asking is that when we're evaluating what would be a better or worse course of action, look not only at the way two options stack up against one another in terms of quantity of pleasure created, but also in terms of the kind of pleasure that's created. And when we don't have experience with both kinds of pleasure, he says we should probably look to some experts. We should probably get the opinion of people who have experienced both kinds of pleasure. And so in part, the response is, if it's hard to quantify pleasures and it's hard to quantify happiness, and we're not exactly sure that all kinds of happiness are worth having or are equal to others, maybe we really ought to, at least in some cases, when we don't have experience with all the options, look to people who do. Look to some experts. And that seems like sort of plausible advice if the problem is understanding what makes us happy and how. Some people also have argued that it's a sort of elitist model, that if you have to ask anybody else what might make you happy, that it removes in some way or makes you reliant on other people in a way that might be elitist, because you would be relying on experts. And it may be in some ways elitist in that you would have to have had experience with both options to fully understand them. But I'm not sure that makes it wrong. So it turns out that it does often help to have experience with multiple options before you decide on them. And I take it that that's Mill's recommendation. Okay. So, and then again, the criticism here, there's two kind of broad criticisms. Quantifying happiness. Some people think it's impossible to quantify happiness. Economists and psychologists, of course, are making valiant efforts to do so. You might think that it's always a little bit flawed. And some people argue that happiness by itself is not a legitimate moral aim. And the utilitarian response is that we don't always have to measure happiness in terms of quantity. Sometimes we could distinguish types of happiness qualitatively, and some goods are qualitatively better than others. So, no amount of a pig's style of satisfaction seems to make up for a distinctively human sort of satisfaction. So no amount of donuts seems to equal the sort of satisfaction of being treated fairly, for instance. Okay, and then a final objection. Utilitarianism is very demanding. It really does ask a lot of people to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and to view your own happiness as only equally important to the happiness of other people. So the thing that utilitarianism does is it asks you to look at your own well-being as no more important than anybody else's well-being. That is to see your own happiness as no more important than anybody else's happiness. You're supposed to treat everybody's happiness as equally important on the utilitarian model. And that asks a lot of people, right? We're accustomed to treating ourselves as special. We're accustomed to treating ourselves and our own happiness as most important. And the utilitarian model asks us not to do that. Right? It says, your happiness is no more important than anybody else's happiness. And that makes for a challenging moral theory. It ends up asking a lot of us. So, at the heart of this objection really is a claim about what a moral theory ought to look like. And the question is, how strict, how stringent, should a moral theory be? And utilitarianism is a fairly strict moral theory. Right? It requires a lot of us. It's stringent. It's difficult. It asks a lot. That is, that we see ourselves as no more important than anybody else. And that is asking a lot of you. And there's a range of types of answers to the question, how stringent can a good moral theory be? Some people think a moral theory is only a good moral theory if everybody will obey it. Right? That is, if everybody will do the thing the moral theory requires, then it's a good moral theory. Right? That's sort of one end of the scale. Another type of answer to how difficult should a moral theory be is, well, a moral theory is too difficult if, or you might say a moral theory is too difficult on one hand if not everybody will comply. On the other hand, you might think, hey, most moral theories that are right, the best moral theories are ones where nobody's going to comply, right? Where nobody's going to get it perfect or get it just right. And the intuitions on either end of the spectrum, on one hand, if nobody's going to comply, but you think it's a good moral theory, then you think nobody out there is morally perfect, right? Nobody's going to get it morally right. You expect the correct moral theory to be the one where nobody really gets it right. On the other hand, you might think, hey, everybody's a good person. So the right moral theory is the one where everybody gets it right. For most of us, we think the truth is somewhere between those two. For most of us, we'll think the appropriate moral theory is a kind of moral theory where maybe most people get it right, or maybe only a few people get it right, or something between those options, where maybe some people will get it right. And in part, the distinction here has to do with whether or not we think people, for the most part, are sort of already living up to the moral code that you think is the right one. Right? If for the most part you think people are good people, that is, that they're already doing the right things, then you might think a difficult moral code is a problem. On the other hand, if you think people are kind of getting it wrong, you might be inclined to think, hey, a difficult moral code is probably right because it's going to require a lot of change from people as they stand now. Of course, you could also look at it entirely disregarding the way you think people stand at the moment and simply concern yourself with a question about possibility. So another response to this is to think about just whether or not a moral code has to produce a sort of result in people to be right. This is the sort of response. Some people argue a moral theory doesn't have to be easy to apply at all. A moral theory doesn't require that anybody will actually follow it to be right. Rather, it just means that people have to be able to follow it. So, if somebody can't do it, if it's impossible to be morally good, that seems clearly, I think, to everybody, like a problem with a moral code. Right? If a moral theory says you're only doing the right thing if you do the impossible, that is, I'm only a good person if I learn how to fly. Right? Well, I can't fly. There's nothing I can do that's going to make myself fly without some contraption or airplane or something like that. But a moral code that requires that people magically start flying is a bad moral code because it's impossible for people to live up to. But a moral code that requires that that you say learn calculus, right? Difficult, but possible, right? We can all do that. It's something we can do. It just may take a ton of work. Then the question is, even if nobody does the right thing, right? As long as it's possible to, the moral code seems perfectly good. Right? Moral code can't ask us to do the impossible, but the rightness or wrongness of a moral evaluation has very little to do with whether or not people actually follow it. And then, of course, we might also think, hey, maybe people just aren't as morally good as we often think. So we're very inclined, I think, as people to think, well, people are decent. People are, for the most part, good. And maybe that's wrong. Right? Maybe, in fact, people really aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And we just don't very often think about it. We just don't very often consider it. So anyway, there's a range of objections to utilitarian thinking and some responses. And we will get together on Saturday and talk about some practical applications in terms of global poverty and allocation of food resources. We'll talk about a utilitarian response to global hunger. That's Saturday. So I hope you've enjoyed the slide, and I will talk to you again on Saturday.